Listen up, beautiful nerds. There was a time when people believed that the cure to pain was to drill a hole into your skull. Sometimes for medical reasons, other times to release evil spirits. Dun 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 dun. Trepanation isn't the only procedure performed without anesthesia, my friends, but it is one of the oldest and one of the most debated. Trepanation is a surgical procedure in which a hole is drilled, cut, or scraped into the human skull. That sounds so savage. This exposes the outer layer of the brain, the dura mater. And what that means, my friends, is this wasn't surface level treatment. Oh no, this was going directly into the skull, into the structure that protects the brain itself. And while that might sound extreme to us now, this procedure dates back to between 7,000 to 10,000 years ago, which makes it one of the oldest known surgical practices in human history. Archaeological evidence shows trepanation across multiple regions of the world. This wasn't something isolated to one culture, my friends. This was happening in different parts of the world. I think that is so cool. And at a burial site in France, dating back to around 6500 BCE, 40 out of 120 skulls 40 out of 120 were found with trepanation holes. That's not rare. That is a pattern, my friends. And it wasn't just humans. Animals are always catching strays, man. Because a cow's skull, cow skull discovered in France, dating back to around 3400 to 3000 BCE, also showed clear signs of the procedure, which raises an interesting possibility. And hopefully, this is what happened, that these techniques were being practiced on animals before people. And that makes me really sad for the animals, honestly. But we have seen patterns in history of trial and error with animals before they start testing humans. And they still do that today with the labs and in the labs with the mice. In early societies, illness wasn't understood the way it is today. There was no understanding of bacteria, no understanding of viruses, no concept of neurological disorders. So when something went wrong in the body, people searched for explanations, right? You can't blame them. But stuff like disease, pain, and abnormal behavior, and this is where the issue comes in, then they were often believed to be caused by supernatural forces. And if someone was acting differently, speaking strangely, or experiencing seizures, or behaved in a way that couldn't be explained, trepanation was believed to fix that. And trepanation was thought to basically release evil spirits, allow harmful bad air to escape, or remove whatever force was believed to be causing the problems. In some cultures, an opening in the skull was believed to allow communication with gods or spirits of the dead. But not all cases were based on spiritual belief, because there is actually strong evidence that trepanation was also used to treat physical injuries. If someone suffered head wounds from a fall or combat or blunt force trauma, there could be brain fragment pressing inward, and that makes sense, right? Blood pooling into the skull or pressure building in the brain. And without modern tools, however, trepanation may have been an attempt to relieve that pressure and to remove damaged bone, to drain bloodletting. So while these explanations weren't spiritual, some explanations were spiritual, others were medical. Now, one of the earliest known instruments was called a trepan, and it was a specialized surgical drill used to bore into the skull. In early periods, practitioners used sharp stones, metal blades, or scraping tools. And over time, these tools became refined, which is a good thing. And some versions of the tool were designed to control depth, to prevent the tool from going too far. So, they had an idea of what they were doing. Some included a central pin, which I think is really cool, to stabilize the instrument while drilling. And, that shows that there was intention. Imagine trying to control an instrument while you're like drilling a skull. Like, I could not. Zzz. They would not want me as their doctor, their barber surgeon. Now, trepanation wasn't done just one way because they had different tools at the time. I don't know which one is more savage. They had scraping of the skull with the stone. They had drilling into the bone and cutting out a section entirely. And this wasn't a quick process, my friends. This took time, sometimes hours. And the person undergoing this was aware, they were awake. Despite the lack of modern knowledge, there's evidence that the practitioners knew, though. Do not mess up the brain. At the time, remember, anesthesia didn't exist. Modern anesthesia wasn't introduced until the 1800s for other procedures. So, patients sometimes were giving alcohol, opium, or herbal mixtures. But of course, there's problems with these substances because they weren't reliable. You don't know how someone's going to act under these influences. They weren't controlled. And they didn't eliminate pain, at least not physical pain. I don't know about emotional. Just kidding. Now, in many cases, people were fully conscious. And this is where it gets interesting, my lovely nerdy friends, because many trepaned skulls show signs of healing and new bone growth around the edges of the opening. And that healing matters because it's one of the ways that archaeologists know that the patient survived after the surgery. When new bone begins forming around the hole, it means that the person lived long enough for the body to start repairing itself after the procedure. And some skulls show months, years, or even decades of healing, and I think that's really fascinating. Some studies suggest survival rates as high as 60 to 70%. That is high. I thought that was surprising to me because I thought that at the time it would be lower, I don't know, like 50%, 40. And in some populations, it was actually even higher than that. And researchers continued to make cool discoveries because one study examined 13 ancient skulls containing trepanation holes, roughly in the same area. And what's interesting is that it was near the back of the skull, which is a particularly dangerous area for this surgery. Yet 11 out of the 13 skulls showed signs of healing and bone regrowth. What's even more surprising is that some people underwent trepanation more than once. So archaeologists have discovered skulls containing multiple trepanation holes, sometimes with different stages of healing, which means they did one, they healed, and they came back for a second procedure. I mean, I can't even think of going through one of these. Imagine two? There's no way. Now, survival, my friends, doesn't mean that it was safe, because survival doesn't tell us what conditions the patient was left in, right? Whether they experienced long-term damages or may have died from complications after the procedure. Patients still face infection, severe bleeding, swelling of the brain, shock, and death. In the 1800s, physician Paul Broca studied prehistoric skulls that had been trepaned, and he noticed that some individuals, including children, showed no signs of head trauma, which suggested that not all procedures were done for injury. He proposed that trepanation may have been done for rituals or spiritual purposes. But identifying trepanation isn't always straightforward because not every hole found in the skull was necessarily made by a surgeon. Dun, 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 dun. Traumatic injuries, infections, and tumors, and even damage occurring after death can sometimes create openings that resemble trepanation. So, trauma to the skull can have pattern defects shaped by the weapon that caused the injury, which I think is so cool. Which means that archaeologists must carefully examine and the bone growth, the healing patterns before concluding, of course, that the hole was intentional. Now, in some cases, the piece of skull that were removed during trepanation weren't always discarded, my friends, but instead they were preserved as amulets or talismans. Talismans are objects believed to provide some sort of protection or luck or spiritual power. And some fragments were worn as charms, like as necklaces. Others may have been carried as protective objects. And in certain historical accounts, skull fragments were even ground into powder and mixed into drinks because they believed that power, protection, or healing properties could be transferred from one person to another. Now, by the medieval period, a different method emerged, and this is very interesting and very mad. The madness was caused by a stone inside the head. But this wasn't real, of course. Some so called healers, the medical scammers of the time, staged fake procedures, making small incisions and pretending to remove a stone to convince patients that they have been cured. Can you imagine that? Like, let's sit on this for a little bit, please. Like, imagine that you are one of the people that had trepanation or had like an incision in your skull because someone is trying to scam you and pretend like it's a magic show. There's the stone for money. The audacity. It's crazy. They ain't got nothing on the scammers of today. That's wild. Now, surprisingly, the basic idea behind trepanation never completely disappeared, my friends, because today neurosurgeons may still create openings in the skull to relieve dangerous pressures on the brain, particularly after severe trauma, bleeding, swelling. Does that sound familiar? Because the difference is that, of course, in modern practices, there's anesthesia, and there's sterile techniques, and there's advanced imaging, and of course, a far greater understanding of how the brain works. What began thousands of years ago as a mixture of observation, necessity, and belief eventually became part of modern neurosurgery. Trepanation sits at the intersection of belief and early medicine because some of its uses was based on superstition and beliefs, others on observations and attempts to treat real physical injuries. But without a true understanding of the brain, the line between healing and harm was just unclear. Thank you for watching, my lovely friends. I am Glory from Archives of the Century. Stay safe, stay weird, stay curious. I'll see you in the archives, my historian friends.